How'd you kick out your cockroach roommate? My roommate's girlfriend had basically moved into our apartment without paying a cent, and when I finally confronted him about it, he defended her like I was attacking his family. Jorge, LaSonia's been here every night for 3 months. She needs to contribute, I said, holding up our utility bill. This doubled. She showers twice a day, uses my meal prep, takes my parking spot. He crossed his arms. She's going through a hard time. You're being petty about groceries. I pointed to my empty shelf in the fridge. That was my food for the week. Again. He shrugged. This is my apartment too. I pay half the rent. I can have guests. Guests don't get mail delivered here, I said. When is she contributing? When she gets back on her feet. Just be cool about it. He kept pushing me to accept it. Relationships require sacrifice. You'll understand when you're serious with someone. She'd rearranged our living room, moved my work setup, used my expensive shampoo. I'd do the same for your partner, he said. She thinks you hate her. Can't you try to get along? I tried being accommodating, labeling my food, setting boundaries. Then Wednesday night she threw a party. Music blasting until 3 a.m., strangers doing shots in our kitchen. I had a presentation at 8 a.m. I texted Jorge to turn it down. Lighten up, it's just one night, he replied. The next week, another party. Someone threw up in the hallway. Then at 2 a.m., their headboard started slamming against my wall. The moaning was theatrical, obviously performative. My boyfriend was staying over. He sat up, disgusted. I can't do this, he said, getting dressed. I'm not coming back here. He left at 3 a.m. I banged on the wall. She laughed louder. Jorge's response the next morning? Sorry we were loud, but it's natural. Get earplugs. The following Tuesday, karaoke party until 4 a.m. on a work night. That's when I snapped. While they were out, I changed the Wi-Fi password. Put a lock on my cabinet, locked my section of the fridge. She came home, couldn't watch her shows, couldn't use her laptop for work. Jorge pounded on my door. What's your problem? Wi-Fi and food are included in my rent, I said calmly. LaSonia can get her own internet and groceries. You can't do this, he yelled. I'll withhold my rent. Great, I said. I'll forward that text to our landlord. His face went pale. LaSonia had a complete meltdown, started screaming that I was ruining her life. That's when the truth came out. She'd been evicted from her place 4 months ago. Not 3 months of visiting, 4 months of lying about apartment hunting. Jorge knew the whole time. We were waiting for the right moment to tell you, he said. I looked at the mail piling up with her name, looked up tenant rights. She could claim residency soon. Our lease said no additional occupants over 14 days per month. The landlord had already asked about the extra car. We could all get evicted. I documented everything. Photos of her belongings filling our coat closet, her mail, screenshots of noise complaints from neighbors I didn't even know had my number. Sent Jorge a formal email, CC'd our landlord. Per our lease, unauthorized occupants must leave within 72 hours. Attach the utility bills, grocery receipts, photos. I won't risk my rental history for your girlfriend's housing crisis. Jorge tried pleading. Where will she go? Not my problem, I said. She had 4 months to figure it out. He called me heartless, selfish, a terrible friend. You have 72 hours, or I exercise my rights under the lease, I said, installing a lock on my bedroom door. LaSonia moved out dramatically, slamming doors, throwing Jorge's clothes in garbage bags. You're gonna regret this, she kept saying. Jorge, tell your roommate about karma. Jorge helped her pack in silence. 2 weeks later, LaSonia showed up at our apartment with 3 police officers behind her. The lead officer looked at me and asked what property she needed to get. I pulled out my phone and showed him the lease clause about unauthorized occupants, my hand steadier than I expected. Jorge stood in the hallway behind them, his face a mix of anger and something that looked like betrayal. The officer took a minute to read through the document on my screen, then turned to LaSonia and told her she could only take items that clearly belonged to her, nothing that was here before she moved in. She started arguing about a coffee maker, but the officer cut her off and said if there was a dispute about ownership, she'd need to handle it through civil court. I watched her face turn red as she realized this wasn't going to go the way she planned. She pushed past the officers and stormed into Jorge's room, yanking open drawers so hard one of them came completely off the track. The banging and slamming echoed through the whole apartment as she threw her clothes into garbage bags, muttering loud enough for everyone to hear about how I ruined her life and destroyed her relationship. Jorge followed her into the room and started helping pack in complete silence, not looking at me or the officers. I stood by my bedroom door with my arms crossed, watching the officers supervise from the hallway. One of them asked if I felt safe, and I nodded, even though my heart was racing. The whole thing took almost 2 hours because LaSonia kept trying to claim things that obviously weren't hers, and the officers had to keep reminding her about the rules. She grabbed her makeup and toiletries from the bathroom, leaving the expensive shampoo she'd been using because she knew it was mine. When she finally finished, she had 4 garbage bags in a suitcase, plus some boxes of shoes and kitchen stuff. The officers waited while Jorge helped her carry everything down to her car, and I went into my room and locked the door. I could hear them making trips up and down the stairs, the sound of the front door opening and closing over and over. Finally, I heard the officers tell them they were done here and to have a good evening, and then the apartment door closed one last time. The silence after they left felt heavy and wrong, like the air pressure had changed. I stayed in my room for another 20 minutes, just sitting on my bed and trying to process what just happened. When I finally came out, Jorge was in the kitchen getting water, and he didn't even glance in my direction when I walked past. I tried to say something, anything, but he turned his back and walked to his room. The door slam was so hard that the picture frame in the hallway fell off the wall and the glass cracked when it hit the floor. I picked it up carefully and set it on the side table, then went back to my room. My phone was on my bed where I'd left it, and I opened my texts to message my boyfriend. I typed out the whole story, explaining about the police and Lasonia finally getting her stuff and how tense everything was now. I hit send and waited, watching the screen. An hour passed, then 2, then 3. I kept checking to see if he'd read it, refreshing the conversation over and over. Finally, at almost 11 p.m., my phone buzzed. The message was short, just one line that made my stomach drop. He needed some time to think about us. No explanation, no reassurance, just that. I read it 5 times, trying to find some hidden meaning or softness in those 8 words. There wasn't any. I couldn't sleep that night, just lay in bed staring at the ceiling and listening to Jorge move around in his room. The next morning, I got up early and made coffee, then sat down at my laptop to email the landlord. I attached photos of the lease clause I'd shown the police, along with screenshots of the text thread where Jorge had threatened to withhold rent. I wrote out a detailed summary of everything that happened, keeping it factual and calm. The police visit, Lasonia's removal of her belongings, the officers supervising the whole thing. I wanted everything on record in case Jorge tried to spin this differently, or claim I'd done something wrong. I explained that I was concerned about potential retaliation and wanted to document the situation for my own protection. Before I hit send, I read through it twice to make sure I sounded reasonable and not emotional. Then I added the landlord's email address and clicked send. My finger hovered over the mouse for a second and then it was done. I closed my laptop and got ready for work, moving quietly so I wouldn't run into Jorge. The apartment felt like enemy territory now, every room a potential confrontation. The landlord's response came faster than I expected, just 2 hours later while I was at my desk trying to focus on work. He said he was scheduling an apartment inspection for next week to verify we were in compliance with the occupancy terms. The email was professional but firm, warning that lease violations could result in penalties or even termination for both of us. That last part made my chest tight because I'd followed all the rules, but Jorge's actions could still get me evicted. I forwarded the email to my personal account as backup and saved it in 3 different folders. The rest of the workday dragged and I kept checking my phone to see if my boyfriend had sent anything else. He hadn't. That evening around 7 p.m., someone knocked on my apartment door. I looked through the peephole and saw Alicia from next door, holding her phone in one hand. I opened the door and she immediately asked if I had a minute. She showed me her phone screen, swiping through videos she'd taken of the loud parties, complete with timestamps showing they'd gone past 3 a.m. multiple times. Her baby was crying in some of the videos, and you could hear the bass thumping through the walls. She'd been keeping records for weeks because her daughter couldn't sleep through the noise. I felt this wave of relief wash over me because someone else had seen what was happening, had proof that I wasn't making things up or overreacting. She said she'd file noise complaints with the building, but wanted me to know she had documentation if I needed it. I thanked her probably 5 times and we exchanged phone numbers right there in the hallway. She told me that other neighbors had complained too, that everyone on this floor had been dealing with it. Before she left, she squeezed my arm and said she was glad it was finally quiet again. The next day at work, my manager pulled me aside during lunch and asked if everything was okay. She said I'd seemed distracted and tired lately, that she'd noticed me zoning out during meetings and missing small details in my reports. My face got hot because I hadn't realized the apartment drama was affecting my job that badly. I explained the situation briefly, keeping it vague but honest about the roommate conflict and housing stress. She listened without interrupting, nodding in the right places. When I finished, she was quiet for a second. Then she said she understood and suggested I take some personal days if I needed to handle the situation. She reminded me that we had employee assistance resources too, including legal consultation. I was grateful but also embarrassed that things had gotten bad enough for people at work to notice. I told her I'd think about the personal days and thanked her for being understanding. Walking back to my desk, I felt this weird mix of relief and shame, like I'd failed somehow by letting my personal life bleed into my professional one. That night around 10 p.m., I was making tea in the kitchen when Jorge came out of his room and stood in the doorway with his arms crossed. He looked at me like I'd just kicked his dog or something. He started saying how I destroyed his relationship and made Lasonia homeless again when she was already struggling. He kept going on about how I could have just been patient while she got back on her feet instead of being so cruel about everything. I set down my mug and told him she had 4 months to figure things out and never once tried to contribute or find her own place. Jorge's face got red and he said, "I don't understand what it's like to have nowhere to go, to be that desperate for a safe place to stay." I reminded him that it's not my job to house his girlfriend when I'm already paying my half of everything and following the lease rules. He said relationships require sacrifice and that I'm too selfish to understand real love. I pointed out that his sacrifice was using my money and my space without asking, and that's not sacrifice at all. The argument kept getting louder, and I could feel my hands shaking because I hate confrontation, but I wasn't backing down this time. My phone buzzed, and it was a text from Alicia next door, asking if I was okay because she could hear yelling through the walls. That's when I told Jorge we were done talking and walked to my room. I pulled out the chain lock I'd bought earlier that day at the hardware store and spent 20 minutes installing it on the inside of my door. Jorge stood in the hallway watching me drill holes and didn't say a word. Over the next few days, he started playing music loudly whenever I was home, like he'd wait until he heard my key in the door and then turn on his speakers. The bass would shake the walls and I'd text him to turn it down, but he'd just ignore me. He also stopped doing his dishes and left them piled in the sink with food stuck on them, attracting flies. I took photos of everything with timestamps showing the dates and times. I documented the dirty plates, the glasses with milk crusting on the inside, the pan with burned eggs that sat there for 3 days. I also recorded the noise levels on my phone's decibel meter app whenever his music got really bad. My bedroom became my safe space, and I only came out to use the bathroom or grab food from my locked cabinet. The inspection happened on Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. like the landlord had scheduled. He showed up with Florian, the building manager, who I'd seen around but never really talked to before. They went through both bedrooms and all the common areas, taking notes on a clipboard. In the recycling bin, they found 3 envelopes addressed to Lasagna, with our apartment number on them. In the bathroom, there was still a pink razor in the shower and expensive face wash that definitely wasn't mine or Jorge's. Florian pulled out a bottle of perfume from under the sink and held it up, asking whose it was. Jorge said it must have been left behind, but the landlord pointed out that the mail was dated from last week, after Lasagna was supposed to have moved out. They found hair ties on the bathroom counter, a makeup bag shoved in the cabinet, and a pair of shoes in the coat closet that were clearly women's size 7 or 8. The landlord made Jorge and me sit down at our kitchen table after they finished looking around. He put his clipboard down and said the evidence showed a clear lease violation that hadn't been fixed. He told Jorge he had 48 hours to confirm in writing that Lasagna would not be returning to the property, or we'd both face eviction proceedings. The landlord was calm but serious, like he'd done this 100 times before. Jorge tried to argue that she was already gone, and those were just items she forgot to pack. The landlord cut him off and pointed to the recent mail delivery and the toiletries that showed regular use. He said the lease was clear about unauthorized occupants, and he wasn't interested in excuses, just compliance with the terms we both signed. He stood up and said he'd expect the written confirmation by Thursday at 5 p.m., or he'd start the eviction paperwork Friday morning. After the landlord and Florian left, Jorge turned on me immediately. He said I'd backed him into a corner and ruined everything, that I was destroying his life over stupid rules. His voice kept getting louder, and he was pacing around the living room. I stayed sitting at the table and told him calmly that he created this situation by lying about how long Lasagna had been staying here. I reminded him that I gave him multiple chances to fix it before involving the landlord. He called me a snake and said I went behind his back instead of working it out like adults. I didn't yell back, just gathered my stuff and went to my room with the chain lock. That weekend, I was scrolling through social media and saw that Lasagna had posted a long rant about being made homeless by a heartless roommate who couldn't show basic human compassion. She didn't use my name, but she mentioned our apartment complex, and the situation was specific enough that people figured it out. The post had like 50 comments with people calling the unnamed roommate terrible and saying they hoped karma would catch up. Then I started getting private messages from people I knew through Jorge, friends from his study group, and people we'd hung out with at parties. Some of them were really angry, saying I should be ashamed for kicking out someone who had nowhere to go. A few people I thought were my friends sent messages asking for my side of the story, but in a way that felt like they'd already decided I was wrong. One girl I'd known since freshman year sent a message saying she was disappointed in me and thought I was better than this. I felt sick reading all of it because I knew my side of the story, but trying to explain would just make me look defensive. My boyfriend finally called me Sunday night and we talked for over an hour. He said he'd been thinking about everything, and he needed to see that I could handle conflict without letting it take over my whole life. He told me he cared about me, but watching the apartment situation spiral had made him question if I knew how to set boundaries in a healthy way. I tried to explain that I did set boundaries and that's why everything blew up, but he said that's not what he meant. He said he needed to see me manage stress better before he felt ready to come back around. I told him I understood and promised to keep the apartment stuff separate from us going forward. He seemed relieved when I said that, and we agreed to meet at the coffee shop near campus on Thursday afternoon. The call ended on a better note than it started, which gave me some hope we could fix things between us. The next morning, I checked my email and saw Jorge had sent the written confirmation to the landlord saying Lasagna would not be returning to the property. The landlord replied thanking him for the cooperation and said the matter was now closed as long as the terms were followed. I felt like I could finally breathe again knowing that issue was officially handled. Then Jorge started his revenge campaign in ways that were just subtle enough to seem accidental. Tuesday morning, I got up from my shower and the hot water ran out after 30 seconds because Jorge had used it all. Wednesday, he parked his car in both our assigned spots by angling it diagonally across the lines. Thursday, his alarm went off at 6 in the morning and blared for over an hour while he was apparently already gone for the day. I banged on his door, but he had locked it and left. Friday morning, the hot water was gone again, and I had to shower in freezing cold water before work. I took photos of his car taking both spots and recorded a video of his alarm going off with the timestamp visible. By the weekend, I was exhausted and frustrated because every single day brought some new petty annoyance designed to make my life harder. I remembered Tristan Rocha from the campus legal aid office who had helped my friend with a landlord dispute last year. Monday afternoon, I walked over to the student services building and found his office on the second floor. He was a young guy, maybe late 20s, with a friendly smile and a desk covered in case files. I explained the whole situation from the beginning while he took notes on a yellow legal pad. He asked to see my lease, and I pulled up the PDF on my phone so he could review the occupancy clause. He also looked through all the photos and documentation I had collected over the past few weeks. After about 20 minutes, he leaned back in his chair and said, I definitely had grounds to request early lease termination based on the hostile living environment Jorge was creating. He also said I could file formal harassment complaints with both the landlord and potentially the police if the behavior continued. I felt relieved that someone with actual legal knowledge was confirming I was not overreacting to the situation. Tristan advised me to send Jorge one written warning about the retaliatory behavior before escalating things to the landlord or authorities. He said having that paper trail would strengthen my case if I needed to take further action later. He helped me draft an email right there in his office that listed the specific issues in clear, factual language without any emotional accusations. The email mentioned the hot water usage, the parking violations, and the alarm disturbances with dates and times for each incident. At the end, I asked Jorge to stop the behavior immediately and said I hoped we could coexist peacefully for the remainder of our lease. Tristan reviewed it and said it was perfect because it was calm and professional while still being firm about the problems. I sent it from my phone before I left his office so I would not chicken out later. Jorge read it within an hour based on the read receipt, but he did not respond at all. I thought maybe the formal tone would make him realize I was serious about documenting everything. Instead, the retaliation got worse in new and creative ways. Tuesday, I came home from work, and the apartment was absolutely freezing because someone had turned the thermostat down to 50 degrees. Wednesday, the Wi-Fi was not working, and I discovered Jorge had unplugged the router before leaving for class. Thursday, the apartment was freezing again, and the Wi-Fi was down again when I got home. Friday, I came back to find the thermostat set to 50, and the router unplugged for the third time that week. Each time I had to wait for the apartment to warm back up and reset the internet before I could do anything. My work from home day got completely derailed because I spent the first 2 hours just getting basic utilities functional again. I documented every single incident with photos of the thermostat settings and timestamps of when the Wi-Fi went down. Saturday, the utility bill arrived in the mail, and I opened it expecting it to be lower now that Lasagna was gone. Instead, it was even higher than the previous month by almost $40. I looked at the detailed breakdown and saw the heating costs had gone through the roof. I realized Jorge must have been running the heat at maximum temperature whenever I was not home just to drive up the bill. When I knocked on his door to confront him about it, he barely opened it and said he had been cold lately, and I could not control what temperature he kept the apartment. I pointed out that the bill showed he was running it at 80 degrees for hours at a time, and he just shrugged and closed the door in my face. I took photos of the utility bill with all the charges highlighted and forwarded everything to the landlord with a detailed email. I explained that Jorge was deliberately running up the utilities as retaliation and asked if there was any way to split the bills separately going forward. The landlord responded the next day saying the apartment was not set up for separate utility accounts, but he was noting Jorge's behavior in his file as a lease violation. He said if the harassment continued, I should document everything and he would take appropriate action. It was not the solution I wanted, but at least the landlord was paying attention now. Thursday afternoon, I met my boyfriend at the coffee shop, and we sat in a corner booth away from other people. I updated him on everything that had happened with Jorge and showed him some of the documentation I had been keeping. He listened without interrupting and seemed impressed that I was handling things through proper channels instead of just yelling at Jorge. We talked for over an hour about the apartment situation and our relationship and where we wanted things to go. By the end of the conversation, we had agreed to take things slowly while I sorted out my living situation. He said he was proud of how I was dealing with everything and wanted to support me through it. He made it clear, though, that he would not stay over at my place until the drama with Jorge was completely resolved. I understood where he was coming from, even though it hurt a little to have that boundary. We left the coffee shop holding hands, and I felt more hopeful about us than I had in weeks. Friday afternoon, Alicia knocked on my door looking annoyed and holding her phone. She showed me photos of Jorge's car parked in her assigned spot from that morning. She said this was the third time in 2 weeks he had taken her space, when both of our spots were occupied by his car and some friend's vehicle. She had already filed a complaint with building management, and wanted me to know in case it affected our apartment. I apologized even though it was not my fault, and thanked her for keeping me informed. She said other neighbors had been complaining too about noise and parking issues related to our unit. I felt embarrassed that our apartment had become known as the problem unit in the building. The following Tuesday, I came home to find an official letter taped to our apartment door. It was from Florian, the building manager, and addressed to Jorge specifically. The letter listed multiple violations, including unauthorized parking in other resident spaces, excessive noise complaints from neighbors, and harassment of a fellow tenant. At the bottom, in bold text, it stated that any further violations would result in immediate eviction proceedings against Jorge. I took a photo of the letter before Jorge got home and saw it. When he came back an hour later, I heard him rip the letter off the door and slam into his room without saying anything. The next few days felt weird in a way I could not explain. Jorge stayed in his room most of the time, and when he did come out, he avoided looking at me completely. He stopped messing with the thermostat, and the Wi-Fi router stayed plugged in. The apartment stayed quiet at night, and I actually slept through until morning without waking up to banging or music or any other noise. I kept waiting for the next problem, but nothing happened. On Wednesday, I made dinner in the kitchen, and Jorge came out to get water from the fridge, but he did not say anything to me. He just grabbed his bottle and went back to his room without even glancing my way. The silence felt heavy, but it was better than the constant fighting. I checked my bedroom door lock every night before bed just to be safe. By Friday, I started to relax a little bit and thought maybe Jorge finally understood how serious this all was. Then Saturday morning, I went to the post office to mail a package to my mom and saw something that made my stomach drop. There was a change of address form sitting in the processing bin with Lasagna's name on it and our apartment address listed as the forwarding location. I asked the clerk if I could speak to a manager and explain the situation. The manager pulled up the form on her computer and confirmed someone had submitted it online 2 days ago. I showed her my lease and the documentation from the landlord about Lasagna being an unauthorized occupant. The manager made copies of everything and said she would flag the address to prevent any mail forwarding. I thanked her and asked for a copy of the attempted change of address form for my records. Back at my car, I sat there feeling angry and tired. Lasagna was still trying to establish residency, even after everything that happened. I took photos of all the paperwork and sent them to the landlord with a detailed email explaining what I found. Then I forwarded everything to Tristan at the legal aid office because I did not know what else to do. He called me back within an hour, and I could hear papers shuffling in the background while we talked. Tristan said Lasagna's continued attempts to use our address could be considered harassment, and that I had options if this kept happening. He explained that her pattern of behavior showed she was not giving up on trying to claim she lived there. I asked him what kind of options, and he said I could pursue a restraining order if she kept trying to establish residency or showed up at the apartment again. The thought of going to court for a restraining order made me feel sick, but I told him I would keep it in mind. He said to document everything and call him if anything else happened. After we hung up, I just sat in my car for another 10 minutes trying to process everything. I did not want to go back to the apartment. The constant stress was wearing me down and I could feel it affecting everything. My work performance had been slipping and I was always tired no matter how much I slept. That afternoon, I texted my friend Lloyd, who lived across town, and asked if I could crash at his place for the weekend. He said yes immediately and told me to come over whenever I wanted. I went back to the apartment and packed a bag with clothes and my laptop. Jorge was not home, so I left without seeing him. The drive to Lloyd's place took almost 30 minutes because of traffic, and I had to pay for gas, which I really could not afford right now. Sitting in his living room that night watching movies and eating pizza, I felt guilty about leaving my own apartment. It was my home and I was paying rent for it, but I could not stand being there anymore. Lloyd asked if I was okay, and I gave him the short version of everything happening with Jorge and Lasagna. He listened without interrupting and then said I could stay as long as I needed. Sunday we went to breakfast and walked around the neighborhood, and I tried not to think about the apartment. But Monday morning I had to go back because I had work and all my stuff was there. When I pulled into the parking lot, I saw an envelope taped to our apartment door. My heart started racing as I walked up and pulled it off. It was from the landlord and addressed to all occupants. Inside was a notice about a mandatory mediation session scheduled for Wednesday afternoon. The letter said, Jorge, Lasagna, and I all had to attend, along with the landlord and a mediator named Jayla Sampson. It listed the time and location at the building management office. I took the envelope inside and knocked on Jorge's door. He opened it just a crack and I held up the letter. He took it from my hand without saying anything and closed the door. I heard him moving around in his room and then his voice talking on the phone, but I could not make out the words. Wednesday came too fast. I left work early and drove back to the apartment to change into nicer clothes for the mediation. Jorge was already gone when I got there. At the management office, I saw the landlord and a woman I assumed was Jayla Sampson sitting at a conference table. Jorge showed up 5 minutes later and sat as far from me as possible. Then Lasagna walked in, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop. She sat next to Jorge and glared at me across the table. Jayla introduced herself and explained the mediation process and ground rules. She said everyone would get a chance to speak, and we needed to find a resolution that worked within the lease terms. Lasagna immediately started talking about how she had been living at the apartment for 4 months, and that gave her tenant rights. She said I had no right to kick her out, and that she had nowhere else to go. Jayla listened without interrupting and took notes on a legal pad. When Lasagna finished, Jayla pulled out a copy of our lease agreement and some printed pages that looked like legal documents. She went through the lease clause about occupancy limits and then referenced state tenant laws. Her explanation was calm and clear. Without being on the lease or paying any rent, Lasagna had no legal standing as a tenant. She was a guest who had overstayed, and the landlord had the right to require her removal. Lasagna's face went red and she started arguing, but Jayla cut her off. The mediator said the facts were clear, and we needed to focus on finding a solution. She looked at Lasagna and Jorge, and then at the landlord. Jayla proposed that Lasagna surrender any spare keys she had made and sign a written agreement to stay away from the property. If she did that within 72 hours, the landlord would not pursue eviction proceedings against Jorge for lease violations. If she did not comply, the landlord would file for eviction, and Jorge would lose his housing and his security deposit. The room went quiet. Jorge looked at Lasagna, and she looked like she wanted to flip the table over. The landlord nodded and said that was acceptable to him. I said it worked for me too. Jayla pulled out a pre-printed form and filled in the details. She slid it across the table to Lasagna with a pen. Lasagna stared at the paper for a long time, and I could see her hands shaking. Jorge put his hand on her arm, but she pulled away. Finally, she grabbed the pen and signed her name at the bottom. Jayla witnessed the signature and made copies for everyone. The mediation ended, and we all left without saying anything to each other. I drove home feeling relieved but also anxious because I did not trust that this was really over. That night, I was right to be anxious. At 6 in the morning, my alarm had not even gone off yet when music started blasting from Jorge's room. It was so loud my walls were shaking, and I could hear every word of the angry rap lyrics. I grabbed my phone and checked the time. 6:04 in the morning on a Thursday. Jorge had to know I would be sleeping. This was pure retaliation for the mediation. I got out of bed and pounded on his door, but the music just got louder. I called the landlord and left a voicemail. Then I called the police non-emergency line and filed a noise complaint. I gave them our address and explained the situation, including the mediation that had just happened. The dispatcher said they would send an officer. Jorge's music kept playing. I heard doors opening in the hallway and knew the neighbors were being woken up too. 20 minutes later, the music suddenly cut off, and I heard Jorge's door open and close. He must have left for class. The police showed up 15 minutes after that. I met the officer in the hallway and explained everything that had been happening. I showed him the signed agreement from the mediation and the landlord's previous warning letters. The officer took notes and said he was filing a formal warning for disturbing the peace. He gave me a case number and said I could get copies of the incident report for my records. Alicia came out of her apartment while the officer was still there. She looked exhausted and was holding her crying baby. She told the officer she had also called about the noise and showed him time-stamped videos on her phone. The officer added her complaint to his report. 2 other neighbors from down the hall came over and said they wanted to file complaints too. The officer took all their information and said this would be documented as multiple complaints about the same incident. After he left, I went back inside and emailed the landlord again with the case number and details. I copied Tristan on the email too. My hands were shaking while I typed because I was so angry and tired. I had to leave for work in an hour and I had barely slept. The landlord called me that afternoon while I was on my lunch break. He said he had received my email and the police report and that he was sending Jorge a final warning letter. The letter would state clearly that one more violation of any kind would result in immediate eviction proceedings and forfeiture of his security deposit. He said Jorge was out of chances, and the next problem would be his last. I thanked him and hung up feeling a tiny bit of hope. When I got home that evening, there was a certified letter taped to our apartment door addressed to Jorge. I left it there and went inside. An hour later, Jorge came home and I heard him rip the envelope open. His door slammed so hard I thought the frame might crack. The next morning, Florian called me to set up the key collection. He said he would be there at 2 in the afternoon, and Lasagna needed to show up with any keys she had made, or the landlord would take legal action. I agreed and marked it on my calendar. Jorge stayed in his room all morning, and I heard him on the phone multiple times, probably talking to Lasagna about what to do. At 1:55, Florian knocked on our door carrying a clipboard and looking very official. He asked if Jorge was home, and I called out to let him know the building manager was here. Jorge came out looking tired and angry, but he did not say anything to me. Florian explained that this was a formal process, and he would document everything that happened. At exactly 2 o'clock, there was a knock, and Florian opened the door to find Lasagna standing there with her arms crossed. She glared at me and started to say something, but Florian cut her off immediately. He told her this was not a conversation, just a simple exchange of property. She pulled 2 keys from her pocket and held them up. Florian asked if that was everything, and she said yes in a voice that made it clear she was lying. Florian wrote something on his clipboard and told her that if any other keys turned up, the landlord would pursue charges for trespassing. Lasagna's face went red, and she tried to argue that she had rights as someone who lived here for months. Florian shut that down fast by reading from his clipboard about the signed agreement and the lease violations. He told her she needed to leave the property immediately, and if she came back without permission, the police would be called. Jorge looked like he wanted to say something, but Florian gave him a look that made him stay quiet. Lasagna threw the keys on the floor instead of handing them over, and stomped toward the stairs. Florian picked up the keys, made another note on his clipboard, and told me to call him right away if she showed up again. After he left, Jorge went back to his room without a word, and I finally felt like I could breathe. That evening, I texted my boyfriend asking if he wanted to meet for dinner. He said yes, and we picked a quiet restaurant near campus. When I got there, he was already sitting at a table looking at his phone. I sat down and started telling him everything that had happened with the mediation and the key collection and the final warning letter. He listened without interrupting, and I could see his face relax as I talked. When I finished, he said he could tell I was handling things better now. He said the apartment situation had been really hard on both of us, but he could see I was taking control instead of just letting it happen. I felt relieved hearing that. He reached across the table and took my hand. He said he would start staying over again on weekends if that was okay with me. I said yes immediately because I had missed him so much. We finished dinner and he walked me back to my car. I drove home feeling better than I had in weeks. Then Wednesday morning I woke up and the apartment was freezing. I tried to turn on the lights but nothing happened. The electricity was completely off. I checked my phone and saw an email from the utility company saying the account was past due and service had been stopped. I felt my stomach drop because I had paid my half of the bill on time like always. Jorge must have skipped his payment. I called the utility company and they told me the full amount needed to be paid before they could turn the power back on. The total was $340. I asked if I could just pay my half and they said no, it had to be the full balance. I was so angry I could barely speak. I paid the entire amount on my credit card because I needed power for work and school. The representative said it would take 4 to 6 hours for service to be restored. I hung up and immediately sent an email to the landlord with the utility bill attached and a detailed explanation of what Jorge had done. I wrote that this was financial sabotage, and I wanted it documented as another lease violation. The landlord responded within an hour saying he would add it to Jorge's file and that this pattern of behavior was unacceptable. I forwarded everything to Tristan at the legal aid office. He called me that afternoon during my lunch break. He said the unpaid utilities combined with all the other violations gave me a strong case for small claims court. He explained that I could sue Jorge for the money he owed me and also request early lease termination due to his ongoing violations. Tristan said he would help me prepare the paperwork and walk me through the whole process. We set up a meeting for Friday afternoon at his office. He told me to bring all my documentation, including utility bills, receipts, emails, and the lease agreement. I felt better knowing I had options and someone who understood tenant law helping me. Friday came and I met with Tristan for almost 2 hours. He helped me fill out the small claims forms and explained exactly what would happen at the hearing. He said Jorge would have to either pay what he owed or explain to a judge why he thought it was okay to not pay his share. Tristan also drafted a letter to the landlord formally requesting early lease termination based on Jorge's violations. The next Monday, the landlord called and asked me to come to his office for a private meeting. When I got there, he had my file spread out on his desk. He said he had reviewed everything and the situation was not working. He offered me 2 options. Option 1 was that I could find a replacement tenant to take over my part of the lease, and he would let me out early. Option 2 was that Jorge could take over the full lease if he found someone to guarantee the rent. Either way, the landlord said Jorge and I could not continue living together. I asked about penalties, and he said if I found a replacement tenant quickly, he would reduce the usual reletting fee. I told him I needed a day to think about it. That evening, I started looking at apartments online. I found a small studio across town that was within my budget if I was not splitting rent. It was only 400 square feet and 20 minutes farther from campus, but it had good reviews and looked clean. I scheduled a tour for Wednesday. The studio was tiny when I saw it in person. The kitchen was basically a hot plate and a mini fridge. The bathroom was so small I could barely turn around, but it was quiet and the building seemed well maintained. The landlord there said I could move in within 2 weeks if I passed the background check. I told him I would let him know. When I got back to the apartment, Jorge was in the kitchen making food. I told him about the landlord's offer and asked what he was planning to do. His face went pale, and he admitted he could not afford the place alone. He said his parents would not co-sign because they were mad about the whole situation with Lasonia. He asked what would happen to him if I moved out. I said he would need to find a new roommate or a cheaper place. He looked genuinely scared, and for a second I felt bad for him, but then I remembered the electricity bill and the noise complaints and everything else he had put me through. I spent that weekend thinking about my options. The studio was expensive for what it was, but I would have complete peace. No more drama, no more Jorge, no more Lasonia. Monday morning, I called the landlord and told him I was giving my 30-day notice. He said that was fine and asked about the reletting fee. We agreed on $200, which was half the normal amount. He said he appreciated my cooperation and would start showing the apartment immediately. I felt relieved and anxious at the same time. The next month was strange. Jorge and I stopped talking completely except for short texts about apartment showings and cleaning schedules. We would pass each other in the hallway without making eye contact. He kept his room clean, which surprised me. I kept my area spotless because I wanted potential tenants to see the apartment at its best. The landlord scheduled showings for Tuesday and Thursday evenings. Different people came through each time, looking at the layout and asking questions about utilities and parking. Jorge was polite to everyone who came through, which was probably the smartest thing he had done in months. After the second week, the landlord called to say several people had applied, and he was running background checks. He said he should have someone selected by the end of the month. I felt a huge weight start to lift off my shoulders. Moving day was getting closer, and I had already started packing my things. Alicia stopped me in the hallway the next afternoon while I was carrying boxes to my car. She said the building felt different now, calmer without the constant noise and drama. I thanked her for all the help with the noise documentation, and she waved it off. She offered to write me a reference letter for my new landlord if I needed one. I took her number and promised to stay in touch. That evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Lasonia. She demanded I drop the small claims case and called me every name she could think of. I screenshot the whole thing and forwarded it to Tristan without responding. He called me back within an hour. He said her continued harassment actually made my case stronger if we needed to file additional claims. I felt relieved knowing she was just digging herself deeper. The next few nights, I spread all my documentation across my desk. Utility bills with highlighted charges, grocery receipts, photos of her belongings, screenshots of the noise complaints. Tristan came over twice to review everything and help me fill out the small claims forms correctly. He walked me through each section and explained what the judge would want to see. He kept saying I had a strong case because everything was documented with dates and amounts. The landlord called me on Thursday morning with good news. He found someone willing to take over my portion of the lease starting next month, a graduate student who worked nights and wanted a quiet place to study. The landlord said this would cut my penalty down to just $200 instead of the full month's rent I was worried about. I almost cried from relief because paying double rent would have destroyed my budget. I confirmed everything in writing that same day. Moving day came faster than I expected. My boyfriend showed up at 8 in the morning with his truck, and Alicia brought coffee for everyone. We loaded boxes and furniture while Jorge stayed locked in his room. The whole process took about 4 hours. When we pulled up to the studio apartment, I felt this weird mix of excitement and sadness. The place was tiny, barely bigger than my old bedroom, but it was mine, just mine. No drama, no unexpected guests, no one touching my stuff. I closed the door behind us and actually felt my shoulders relax for the first time in months. My boyfriend helped me unpack the essentials and set up my bed. He ordered pizza for dinner, and we ate sitting on the floor because I didn't have a table yet. That night he stayed over, and we both slept through the whole night without any noise or interruptions. In the morning, he told me he was proud of how I handled everything. He said watching me stand up for myself made him respect me more. He wanted to make our relationship work now that the stress was gone. I believed him because things felt different between us, calmer and more solid. 2 weeks later, I got a notice from the court. They scheduled a mediation date for the small claims case in 6 weeks. The same day, Tristan forwarded me an email from someone claiming to be Jorge's lawyer. They offered to settle for 60% of what I was owed to avoid going before a judge. I called Tristan immediately to ask what he thought. He said settlement was usually faster and less stressful than court. We talked through the numbers and I realized 60% would still cover most of my actual losses. The lawyer fees and time off work for a court date might cost more than the 40% I would be giving up. After sleeping on it for 2 days, I told Tristan to accept the settlement offer. Jorge's lawyer sent over the paperwork within a week. Jorge paid me through a cashier's check that arrived in the mail. The case got officially closed and I filed all the documents away. It felt anticlimactic, but I was glad to have the money and be done with the whole thing. The landlord scheduled the final walkthrough of the old apartment for the following Tuesday. I met him there with my copy of the move-in inspection report. We went through every room together, and he took photos of everything. Jorge's room had stains on the carpet from spilled drinks and marks on the walls where furniture had been moved around roughly during the parties. The landlord noted all the damage and said those costs would come out of Jorge's portion of the security deposit. My room was spotless because I had cleaned it thoroughly before leaving. The landlord handed me a check for most of my security deposit right there. He said he appreciated tenants who took care of the property and followed the rules. I shook his hand and walked out of that building for the last time. That weekend I went through my social media and started unfriending people. There were at least a dozen mutual friends who had sent me nasty messages after Lasagna's posts. People who never asked for my side of the story or tried to understand what actually happened. Each time I clicked unfriend, I felt a little sad about losing those connections. Some of them I had known since freshman year. But I was better off without people who would believe lies without even asking me what really happened. The drama was finally over, and I could focus on my own life again. Work got so much easier once I started sleeping through the night again. I could focus during meetings without my brain feeling like mush. My projects got done on time instead of me scrambling at the last minute because I was too exhausted to think straight. 3 weeks into living at the studio, my manager called me into her office for my quarterly review. She pulled up my performance metrics on her computer and smiled. She said my productivity had jumped 20% over the past month, and my attention to detail had improved significantly. She asked what changed, and I told her I had moved to a quieter apartment. She nodded and said it showed in my work. She was considering me for a team lead position opening up next quarter. I walked out of that meeting feeling proud of myself for the first time in months. Thursday afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. I opened it and immediately recognized Jorge's typing style. The message said I had ruined his life and destroyed his relationship, and he hoped I was happy now that he was struggling to afford rent alone. He said I was selfish and heartless and karma would catch up to me eventually. I read it twice and felt my jaw clench. Then I blocked the number without responding. I deleted the message thread and added him to my blocked contacts list. That door was closed now, and I had no interest in opening it again. The next morning, I got an email from someone named Rebecca with a subject line about the old apartment. She said she was the new tenant who took over my portion of the lease. She wanted to thank me for being honest with her during the apartment showing about the previous drama and noise issues. She said she appreciated the heads up because it let her set clear boundaries with Jorge from day one. She told me Jorge had been a decent roommate so far, keeping to himself and staying quiet. She said knowing the history helped her avoid the same problems I had dealt with. Reading her email gave me this weird sense of closure I didn't know I needed. At least something good came out of the whole mess. Saturday evening, I sat in my studio apartment with takeout containers on my coffee table. The place was tiny, just one room with a kitchenette and a bathroom barely big enough to turn around in. My bed took up most of the space, and I had to get creative with storage. The rent was $200 more than my half of the old place. But sitting there in complete silence, I realized I had learned something important about standing up for myself. I used to avoid conflict and try to keep everyone happy even when it hurt me. Now I knew how to set boundaries and enforce them even when people pushed back. My boyfriend was coming over later, and our relationship felt stronger than it had in months. We weren't fighting about my living situation anymore. The apartment was small and the rent was higher, but I had peace. That made everything worth it.